Was this because Napoleon III had great love for the unwashed populace? No. Napoleon III was a Saint-Simonien who believed in the combination of technology, industry, and capital in order to make an economy prosper. And he was a kind of a supply sider in the sense that if people at the top were making a lot of money, then it would sink down to the bottom. People at the bottom would do better, and the whole float would go up. Okay? I'll leave the efficacy of the economics of that to your own decision. But in order to do this, you need workers. And he had a rising proletariat. Remember, he had all those people who were coming in from the provinces, right, to find impoverished people who wanted to find work. In order to get good workers, you have to have healthy workers. So now we go back to the state of the city as it was earlier on. And so consequently, he was no particularly great humanitarian. He was doing this for ulterior motivation, largely to take the vast majority of the people in Paris who were impoverished and make them healthier so they would be better workers. And then there's that business about the glory of his empire, make it a monumental and demonstrate how good things were. So this is what he got. These are samples of Haussmann's work. And if you compare the first two slides, right, of the old Paris, with this Paris, wide avenues, very solid buildings, beautiful parks, and the jewel in the crown, the Garnier Opera, you can see that there's a huge difference. This was all taking place in central Paris, by the way. And so now I want to look at a little detail. All right, the old and the new. What are the characteristics of this new city? Wide, straight, level avenues, ending, that's the Arche de la Défense, ending in a monument. Why? Because as the eye follows the avenue, then the glory of Napoleon III is displayed at the end. Before Haussmann, the average size of the Paris street was 39 feet. After Haussmann, the average size of the Paris street was 79 feet. Nice, pleasing to the eye, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. Also added to commerce, because in order to get things to circulate through the city, you need good streets, okay? He created over 500 miles of new streets in the new Paris. Sidewalks. There were very few sidewalks. You didn't dare walk in the old Paris because you would be covered with filth very shortly. Sidewalks were an innovation, and they were bordered by trees. He planted 2.5 times the number of trees that had been there before. In order to do this, he created nurseries, and he brought in whole staffs of gardeners to grow trees to supply the city. The buildings, which we'll get into pretty soon, they're very solid, very solid stone, but this is the new Iron Age, and so the interior of the building is very solid because it's held up by metal. We're going to take a look at the intersections. There's a whole series of interlocking, I guess you'd call them traffic circles in the United States, but they're very large. And in Paris, one moves from place to place, all right, with these interlocking streets that had been created. The railway stations were moved farther out because Haussmann moved the factories farther out to the periphery of the city. He didn't want industry taking away from the beauty of the new capital that he was creating. What did this do? Well, I'm going to tip my hand. One of the things that it did was that the workers followed the factories and they went to the outskirts. So now we're starting to establish two zones, a wealthy interior zone and a poor peripheral zone. Creation of green spaces. Again, this goes along with improving the general health. And this was not particularly a Napoleon III desideratum. This was Haussmann's vision. The city is seen as an organic whole. And by that I mean he ran roughshod over some neighborhoods that weren't too bad. But in order to open the city, it had to be seen as a totality. And so He bulldozed his own, the house where he was born. He bulldozed the church in which he was baptized. I mean, he had no sentiment about this kind of thing at all, because for him, the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. I'm going to give you one illustration as to how he did this. Here's the center of the city, the old center of the city. This is the Ile de la Cité, where the first Gallic tribes settled in the middle of the river for defensive reasons, obviously. Take a look at it. It is, in essence, a medieval city. Narrow, winding streets, houses upon houses, crowded. There were 20,000 people living on this little island. This is where the great cathedral of Notre Dame is, right there, okay? Haussmann, during his 17-year tenure, built 10 new bridges over the Seine. This one was there already. It's called the Pont Neuf, the new bridge, which is the oldest bridge in Paris. He built a bridge here. And in so doing, he knocked down a bunch of buildings, but he put the police station here, a big hospital here, and he opened up Notre Dame. There have been houses there. If you go to visit the great cathedral, you'll notice that there's a parvis or an open space in front of it. All that was created by Haussmann. When he was done, the 20,000 people who lived on the island were reduced to 5,000 people. This was going to happen in many of the things that he did. And people who were removed were people who could no longer afford to live there. Now, the consequence of this was that the heretofore center of Paris now became a place for the police, for courts, and for tourists. And with the building of the new bridges, this is the Pont Saint-Michel, that's the Pont du Change, if you know, in Paris. It became strictly a place to get across the Seine. So unless you had police or court business or wanted to go to church in the cathedral, you didn't have any reason to be there. The center of Paris is being displaced, and it's going to be displaced to the west into the wealthier neighborhoods. Now this is a modern aerial shot of Paris taken from a satellite. And what I've done is to highlight just some of his early innovations, because I would have been at this for hours if I wanted to trace everything. This is what you just saw in that prior slide. This is where the bridge goes across the Ile de la Cité. This is the Boulevard Saint-Michel, which he built, and this is the Boulevard de Sébastopol, which goes into the Boulevard de Strasbourg. Okay? So it's a north-south pointing axis. This is the Rue de Rivoli, which had pre-existed, but which Haussmann modernized. It was called the Great Cross, because it forms a cross. And then he started building outward. So this is the Boulevard Saint-Germain, this is the Boulevard du Montparnasse, and this is the street that's named for Haussmann himself, and in his modesty, he put it off into the third stage of development. So that he started working in 1853, that street was not started until 1862. But just from those few illustrations, you can see what's happening, right? Paris is being straightened. It's being opened, because now you can get from here to there in straight lines. And if you follow the Boulevard Haussmann down here, that's the Avenue de Friedland, which is its extension, you get to the Arc of Triumph, which is one of the great circular roundabouts that's going to facilitate movement. Now, before we get to that, let's talk about the railroads for a moment. This is the industrial age. 1837,